So since we wanted to sort of figure out how we can improve podcasters' lives by giving them a product that they can use and they could sort of hopefully improve their life, improve their podcasting experience, maybe increase their audience, and somehow give them a better experience. Right now, what we have is Podcovery, a search engine that sort of transcribes all the podcasts, and then you go there and just search for a topic or a subject or an excerpt from a podcast, and it'll tell you, hey, this subject, for example, democracy, right? These podcasts are talking about this, but not just talking, but also exactly what part of the podcast or what time in that podcast they're talking about this. So instead of just, if there's a 2 hour long podcast and you're just trying to uh, sort of listen to it and find what part of the podcast they're talking about, that you could just jump there and listen to that excerpt. But we also wanted to talk to, some of the podcasters and see if this is something that they would be using and if this could help them. Hey, Aaron. So I'll give it to you from here. I tried to explain.
It's great. No, it's a really good start. Yeah, I'm getting it so far. And you say you didn't know how to quite explain it, but well, that was I get it. It's good. Okay. And it's a simple concept, isn't it? I think for me, that's, as a marketer as well as a podcaster, I think it is just really interesting, this whole kind of granular level targeting. That's what I'm really interested in sort of discussing and exploring here, because that's the big difference. I mean, you pick up your smartphone and you go to the podcast kind of app, if it's an iPhone, and you look at it, and it's just too big. There's just too many opportunities, and it's really hard to find something that's going to be meaningful unless you get a word of mouth recommendation. And for me, that's always the biggest gap, is I don't know what I don't know. So as a listener, it's really hard to find it. But as a podcaster, you just think you're going to be potentially picked up by anybody, and it's not really targeted. So I was really fascinated when, you made contact. I thought, oh, this could be something really quite special. So I'm definitely interested in hearing more.
Yeah. So I mean, Aaron, feel free to take it from here. I was just trying to start the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you both for your patience. It's been kind of a hectic morning so far for me, but this is great, and thank you so much for hopping on, Neil, and showing interest. I think as I mentioned, we're in this learning phase. We have some sort of functionality out of the box, but really what we're trying to do is see how can we bring the most value to podcasters like yourself, and what gaps or opportunities or that sort of thing exist in your world. And what are the pain points really in your everyday that gives you a little bit of trouble or a little bit of pause as you try to get your podcast from an idea all the way to published and listened to at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think there's probably, for me, there's two main pain points. I think probably one is really accurate targeting. I want to be really targeting the growth with very specific listeners. I know who my target audience is. I have a West Coast US audience, and I've got a UK audience. Seems to be very little in between, which is really interesting, because I haven't necessarily targeted West Coast US, but thank you guys, because it is lovely that you're listening to me, according to the statistics. And so that's really positive. It must be some of the UK accents that I get, with my guests. Predominantly, I mean, I do get American guests, but a lot of them are UK based. So maybe it's just the accents that people like. But what I'm targeting really is a predominance of startup entrepreneurs, marketers who are working in kind of big corporates or maybe smaller businesses, people who are business owners, and really kind of sharing marketing and sustainability and good kind of mindful living and mindful marketing best practice. So that's the kind of core of the offer. But what I'm finding is that I'm kind of I don't know, it's really, really difficult as a podcaster, knowing that that's the audience you're picking up. It's almost the audience comes to you just kind of by default. And as somebody who, again, being a marketer, I'm all about kind of really tight propositions and messages. So I want to make sure that the market is getting the right messages from me. So if I'm looking at thought leadership on those topics, so mindful marketing and mindful living, I want to be sure I can align who's actually listening to the podcast with the messages and the interviews that I'm putting out there. At the moment, it feels like it's a little bit hit and miss. So if there was any kind of way that there was a technology or a service like Recovery coming through that was able to kind of align where I'm pushing out with people doing really, really accurate searching, then as a podcaster, it would be very worth my while putting in key search terms or specific tags, or in some way kind of categorizing at a really detailed level the kind of content that I'm pushing out there. At the moment, I don't feel like that's really served. And whilst, there's great distribution services, and I use what was Anchor, so Spotify's sort of podcasting service, which has now been rebranded, to do my distribution. And that is great, and it's simple and it's easy, but I don't feel the targeting is there. So I think there's a real gap in the market for aligning what a podcaster's pushing out with an audience that's trying to find similar content, which I guess is the kind of proposition that you guys are kind of working with.
Yeah, we've found a lot of similarities, I think, in much of the distribution process, so the post-production process. Even when we think about social ads that people have done on Google or Facebook, as we've talked about with previous podcasters, there's just a lack of success there because not only are you trying to target probably a niche, but it's really difficult to find not only that niche when they're the most receptive to listening to the podcast. So if you're browsing on Instagram all day and you're just scrolling, and you are a prospective listener, chances are you're not going to go from that scrolling behavior over to Spotify or over to Apple to now become a podcast listener, right? There's two very different things. So when people are searching for this type of content and searching for topics and other items of interest within that niche, it's much more of a, kind of a pull method of trying to get them over to you, as opposed to getting to them when they least expect it. So there's definitely something there. You mentioned something around the specific niche that you're ultimately going towards. Was there another pain point that you said you had as well? I thought you mentioned that you might have two.
Yeah, sorry, I got a little bit carried away with that one because that's the number one. That's the number one, yeah. And I tend to
we can dive into that one too, much more if you want.
Passionately that there's a gap there. I suppose the other one really is the kind of reporting. Again, as a marketer, I'm quite used to quite deep insights through something like Google Analytics, for example, for a website, or all the various kind of social media insights that you can get. And so you can do like proper evaluation of how you're performing. I feel there's a big gap there. And I was kind of hoping that in time, some of the services that might be kind of developing would allow that level of granular, almost forensic reporting, because I think, again, as a podcaster, what you want is to really understand, not just, rough demographic information or sort of a geographic spread. So I know quite confidently that it's UK, US, my audience predominantly, but I want to know more detail. I want to know how often they're listening. I want to know, which episodes they're more interested in. And is there a geographic split between, people in the US want to listen to certain types of content, because then I can start to be, really quite strategic in the way that I plan the episodes, rather than it being all about me wanting to put stuff out there. I can then start to respond to the audience, really. And I guess you could argue, well, why don't you do a feedback survey or something like that, or run a poll? But I'd rather that it was something a little bit more subtle than that was running in the background as part of some kind of platform that allowed some proper planning, rather than just, chuck content out there and just hope it sticks.
Mm-hmm. And the reporting today, correct me if I'm wrong, because Mahdi and I are not podcasters. We from the reporting that we've seen, it's much more retroactive reporting, and it's a little bit higher level. So it will show you your popularity by even by like potentially timestamps on episodes. And so you can go back in time and say, well, these episodes were popular, therefore this topic might be popular. But there's a lot of guesswork involved there on your behalf. And then to your point, it's not proactively, it's not helping you figure out what to tackle next. It's much more, it's always just looking back in the past.
Yeah, it is. And I think, again, that's a real kind of opportunity, I think, there, because, as somebody who is a bit more planful and strategic, that is absolutely what I want, so that I can do it customer focused rather than just, hey, I've got a great message, I want to do some interviews and just throw them out there. So I think you're right. It is something that allows us to kind of go to a deeper level of understanding rather than it being always surface. And, I do give a cursory glance at the statistics that come through, so I know roughly kind of what's going on. But the other thing, I suppose, actually building on your point about the episodes, is that over time, what I've noticed is that some of the very more kind of, I guess you could call them archive episodes that come through, because I've done about 320, I think it is, episodes now on my podcast, and I would say some that are maybe 200 episodes old, so some of the very much earlier ones, which are a very different style to what I'm doing today, are still popular and still get listeners. Now, one, I find it really hard to understand how that can be, but two, wouldn't it be interesting if I was able to almost put some of the archive episodes into almost like playlists, so that by using some kind of categorization, I could actually then stream them again, or maybe promote them again as part of a playlist, because again, that would be ultimately very searchable, I guess, for a service like you're developing. So I think there's potentially control here from the podcaster side as well as from the actual audience side. And I think that would be a very interesting angle with, particularly for us who have done quite a few podcasts now.
That's really interesting. I think that because there's a lot of industries that could just, I don't know, we live in this world now that we're in this 24-hour news cycle, that it doesn't matter what the new thing is next, is that you're constantly wanting to follow up and check whatever your favorite news source is several times a day, to see if there's anything else that's trending. But that doesn't necessarily mean that very important things are happening on a second by second basis. And that's not, I feel like there's not a lot to, I think, glean from that, as opposed to just staying up to date. Whereas topics of interest, that like marketing as an example, chances are, baked into your 50th episode, which was maybe a couple of years ago, there's a lot of really very relevant learnings there, and conversations that you probably have had that is just as relevant as it is, was then, it is today. It hasn't changed that much or that quickly. And I think the majority of topics are probably like that, just across the board, where, even if you do a Google search today, you might not find something that's published in 2023, and you'll find something that's published in 2020. And it still is just as relevant as the consumer today. So buckling those all together,
that would be very, very interesting, I think, because from a marketing speak, that's the difference between stock content and flow content. So stock content being something on your website that might be, the about us, contact us, company profile, so kind of standard stuff that never goes out of date. And there's one type of podcast there, and then maybe the flow content side, which is much more newsworthy, blogs, social content. That would be the flow kind of podcast. I'd say probably mine is kind of 70-30 split in favor of stock content, because a lot of the stuff, as you say, doesn't go out of date. Some of the stuff that is a little bit more topical, like, I don't know, top tips for 2023 for social media, for example. I mean, clearly by the end of this year, that is outdated. But I would say probably 70% of the style of my podcast, would still be relevant 2 years later, just because of the nature of, the conversations and the interviews. So I hadn't thought of it in those terms either. And I think that could be actually a very interesting one to explore. And if there was some way of kind of categorizing or searching on that kind of content, I've certainly never seen anything out there like that. So that would be a very interesting feature.
Yeah. I think it's obviously going to vary by, from topic to topic. There's going to be those listeners that come in and want just whatever the trending information is, versus more of the stock content that potentially doesn't go out of date, or not very quickly, at least. That'll be interesting to kind of see eventually, Mahdi, just for our own reporting, once we get more listeners to the site. What are those topics, and are people focusing on more trending information, or are they focusing on things that kind of withstand the test of time a little bit more?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm thinking about the playlist feature that you said, you create a playlist for the audience of the parts that you think are relevant to each other from different episodes, and, sort of categorize them. I'm thinking about like that. How would you want to go about it? Like, is it going to be certain parts of each episode that you want to select and sort of create like a longer episode from those sections, or you're just going to be selecting these are the episodes that relate to this category, and I just want to create a playlist for it?
Well, now you've opened up this opportunity. I'll have the deeper level of detail, please. I guess in my head, I was just thinking it would be episode by episode. So this one's stock, this one's flow. But actually, now you say it, there's potentially then an additional feature, which is, as part of maybe a 1 hour episode, the first 20 minutes were, newsworthy, so it's flow. But then actually the next part of the conversation, which because I'm guessing that Podcovery would be something that could drill down, within episodes to, kind of certain points in an episode, then maybe then it turns into being, hey guys, you've got to listen to this because this is never going to go out of date from, 18 minutes in to 36 minutes in. This is stuff that's going to be timeless. So yeah, now you've opened up that opportunity. I'll take that version, please. That sounds, really, really interesting. I'm not going to say no to any of this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It is an interesting idea, though. We never actually thought about it this way.
It is. Well, once you start thinking about these things, and you think about it from the customer or the audience perspective, it can opens up loads more opportunities. I mean, I've been, I guess, to this point just blinkered by what's available, and I've really been thinking about the content rather than either the delivery or the measurement or the the tagability of episodes. But now I'm starting to think about this. I'm thinking actually it is much more about the listener than it is about me. Which is good marketing, of course, but it's very easy to get kind of trapped by what you have experienced so far rather than think outside the box. So this could be opening up something very interesting, which I'm guessing is kind of a interesting conversation you've been having with other podcasters. I mean, there must be some really cool ideas coming through there.
Yeah,
definitely. There's a lot of I think interest just to make it a little bit easier. It's one of those industries now that it's growing so fast, and there's so many services out there, and there's so much that I think other teams are trying to do to create value in this space, and there's a lot of waste as well. I think because of that speed, but maybe lack of value, and that's not where the route that we're ultimately trying to go. We're trying to really better understand, at a deep level, what can actually help here, because we're all the podcasters with all the resources in the world, like the Joe Rogans and Tim Ferrisses of the world that have teams around them, they'll figure this stuff out, right? And they'll get somebody on their team likely to potentially do some of this timestamping, potentially do some of these other features, playlists. I don't know what's even in their toolbox. So there's a lot there. Whereas the vast majority of podcasters out there that have amazing things to say, have amazing topics, cover very interesting things, and there's lots of more listeners out there for them. They're not getting necessarily as much of the touches as those big guys do. So that's where we're really trying to focus and hopefully improve that world. Neil, when you think about these now, I think 3 different areas that we've talked about, are you doing anything today to mitigate them and or focus on them, or is it just simply, hey, this stuff doesn't exist, so therefore I can't do it?
Yeah, I'm hoping there's a big podcast show in London in a couple of months' time, actually about 6 weeks' time now, which will be the first time that I've gone to it. It is for mostly for producers and podcasters, and there's going to be hopefully quite a few vendors there as well. So I'm hoping that it might kind of kickstart a few more ideas and things that will feed into my thinking. I guess, though, you're absolutely right to this point. Really, I've been, I guess, quite sort of not naive to the opportunities, but I haven't really proactively gone beyond what has just been presented to me. I've been much more focused on creating the content and then just pushing it out with, a really kind of patient attitude. And I think a lot of people have done, upwards of a couple of hundred podcast episodes will be playing the long game. And I think for a lot of us, we know that there is a back catalogue. Obviously, we've got, a lot of episodes which, we've got the recordings of anyway, so we could always either republish or come through with a different platform, in the future. So I think a lot of us are kind of future-proofing ourselves without really kind of trying to push the boundaries right now. But if certain features and certain opportunities come up with new platforms and new services, then I'm very, very confident that a lot of people would say, hold on a minute, this is a proper channel for distribution. I can either become my own radio station, or I can use it as part of a digital channel that gets my message out if I'm a brand, for example, or a corporate. So I think there's huge opportunity here to kind of really kind of break the mold, because it feels like it's quite static. It might just be, my experience of it, but it feels like it hasn't moved on in the last 12 months or so. There's a lot of people doing small things, but it's very much repeating the same thing. And I think for me, it needs to have some sort of, revolution or some ground changing opportunity to, get more data, get more evidence, be better at tagging, being better at searching and being found. And I think it's those things that are going to allow some much better targeting. And for me, that's kind of where the growth comes from. I'd much rather have 10,000 people who are actually listening than 1 million people who kind of say they've heard of me, but heard of the podcast, but actually they don't listen at all. So I'd much rather go for quality rather than quantity. So I think that's kind of where you guys would step in, because I think with that kind of focus that you're talking about, it just feels that's the missing piece of the jigsaw. So I'm really excited about what you're doing.
I think that's very helpful, because there's I think most of the services, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the services today, at least that we've seen, is trying to get you that quantity if there is something out there. But again, it's not as smart as we would like it. So as you've mentioned a lot in our conversation here about what your niche ultimately is, getting more of those users directly to you, potentially spreading them out. So maybe there's some more East Coasters or Midwesterners from the US, sprinkled in, not just fully West, and UK, but still really interested and really loyal to the topics that you ultimately cover. So you're gathering an engaged following, as opposed to just, as you mentioned, some people that jump in once in a while.
And I think that's really where the whole kind of community thing would potentially come in the future. I mean, I'm doing quite a lot of research and running a few sessions now in the metaverse for marketers. And that's an interesting, very, very early adopter kind of step into that space. And I'm wondering, just curiously, whether there's an opportunity for building a podcast following, and then that kind of morphs into other things like metaverse, VR and AR kind of worlds and stuff like that. Because I think if you're building a community potentially in the podcast sphere, there's no reason why that now, because we've got video podcasting as well as audio podcasting, whether that wouldn't blend into some kind of VR, AR immersive thing as well. I could imagine in the future, this all becomes one thing. But without the data to know how to target and how to get to it, you're just flying in the wind again. I think this is the real missing piece of the pie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And how many podcasters are authors as well, right? Trying to publish books for their audience. But if they don't have a good, idea or pulse of who their audience is, then as you mentioned, you're just kind of throwing ideas against the wall. And hopefully once it's in writing, then people ultimately read that book. But there's a huge risk there. And especially from a time perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the AR/VR one is actually very interesting. They're all just channels at the end of the day, right? And
yes,
whether it's you have a message and you're getting content out there, and there's various ways that you could ultimately do that. Podcast videos, probably some that you already toy with today. You might as well check out some other channels that are future seeking.
Yeah, so and I think it's a really exciting space. No, it really is.
That one is very interesting to me too, because just the fact that even Spotify is bringing or has brought video into their platform as well, and I think that they've seen an interesting uplift there for a lot of types of listeners, opening up the channels and ways that people ultimately like to digest content is going to be something that all the big players are going to be focused on, much more all the actual players, the Apples and the Spotifys of the world. If we could help Mahdi, as we start talking about some of this reporting, if there's anything that we could potentially do and tools that we could help with that second main pain point, Neil, that you were mentioning around some of the more granular reporting, so you get a better idea of trending information and what you could potentially talk about in the future. If there's a channel specific thing there too, that could be very interesting. As an example, a greater percentage of people are listening to you in an AR environment in the future, right? So something down the line, then that helps you better understand where you can invest more of your time from a channel perspective and more of your efforts.
Yeah, there's a real efficiency thing going on there. And again, as soon as you described it that way, I was thinking, certainly for some of my clients and some of the companies that I kind of mentor and work with, that would be absolute gold dust for them, because it is about priorities. It's about efficiencies, spending resource in the right place in the right way. At the moment, they'd be guessing. Well, most of them would be quite resistant to really, being early adopters and moving into these spaces. But the ones that could be convinced would need the evidence that it was a good investment of time and energy. So I think, that would really back up, again, this growth of it as a channel. So just purely podcast, but also, this broader sort of set of channels that we're talking about. So I think, again, it could be that this kind of reporting style, as much as the tagging and targeting, maybe the reporting side of things is, equally as important, as almost as a byproduct, but as a very valuable byproduct. Yeah. I can certainly see there's a market for that. Definitely. Yeah, that's fascinating.
I was wondering, Neil, how are you currently figuring out what topics to discover, and how do you carry on your research about what's going to be the next episode about?
Yeah, so I keep quite close to the marketplace. So as I just mentioned there briefly, I've got quite a few clients and also organizations that I mentor, as well as kind of look after from a client perspective. And I listen very intently to them. I kind of watch when they're ready for certain things. Most of them are resistant to most things that aren't traditional, or that everybody else has done. So they're not necessarily at the cutting edge. And that is in most cases. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of listening for the right kind of timing. I am quite a sort of techie marketer. I'm quite a gadget marketer. I'm quite an innovative marketer. It's kind of just what I enjoy. So I kind of find that sort of space and that listening really quite intriguing. And it's kind of really using that data, and then, as anybody else would, a lot of the social streams, just for keeping on top of, who's saying what. And, obviously all the AI stuff is a really hot trending sort of topic right now. But I'm trying to look beyond that and see kind of what's next after that. So not necessarily just getting caught up in all the noise, but actually looking a little bit more broadly. But that's why having a very clear target audience, and for me, it's kind of marketers and business developers and entrepreneurs. So I kind of know that those are the people I'm listening to on a daily basis. So I kind of just take a sense of, just by asking the question, what are you looking at? What are you listening to? What are your pain points? I mean, much as you started this conversation with me, I kind of do that to them. And it's just actively listening, really. And I think, a lot of people, could do more of that. I find that's a really useful thing to me. I'm quite a quiet, introverted person myself, so I much rather be on the listening side. I guess that's why I'm an interviewer on the podcast, because I'd much rather listen than do the talking, even though some people say, oh, you do a lot of talking, Neil, but I'm actually more comfortable listening. So I kind of guess that kind of is how I then gather. So I don't do lots of expensive kind of market research programs or anything like that. It is just having my ear to the ground all the time, really. So what I kind of then feed back in my episodes is generally an overview of really what people are, en masse kind of thinking and talking about predominantly.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think there's an interesting challenge, I think, with podcast and everything that you were mentioning so far around really diving into the deep targeting that is necessary to better understand your audience, because excuse me, your episodes and most podcast episodes are not that short compared to other ways and other media that we digest, right? So there's a cliff that people have to sort of jump off of to to get the details that they want, and they need to invest a little bit more time than they typically would. You can't digest this stuff as quickly, so it is more like a long form type of content stream anyway. So there's an investment that people need to make. So the quality factor, I think, is even more important in the podcasting world than any other type of media that I think currently exists. Maybe there's something else out there that's potentially a little bit longer. But because there's so many podcasts, if you don't receive, from a listener perspective, you don't receive what you want, or feel like you got a lot of value out of that podcast, there's so many others that you'll probably jump to. So I think it behooves the podcaster themselves, like yourself, to figure out who that audience is, really dive into who that audience is, get more of those loyal followers. And then they're going to, if they see that value, they're going to tell way more people about it. So your word of mouth increases pretty heavily. Plus, entrepreneurs are typically a pretty tight-knit community, right? There's a lot of niche media sources for them that they tend to gravitate towards.
There is, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think they probably, more than your average person listening to podcasts, would be the ones who would have their favorites. I think they would potentially be very, very loyal. I think probably the most extreme example is, probably Gary Vaynerchuk's following, on the Gary V audio experience, which one of the world's kind of most popular podcasts is, there is just the perfect example of a loyal podcast following. I mean, they just would listen to every single episode. And I suppose most of us do aspire to that kind of level of loyalty, if not necessarily that level of numbers of audience. But I think it's really important to remember you're kind of asking a lot of the audience to commit to listening to a 50 minute podcast. Mine are generally just north of 50 minutes on average. So, it's a big old commitment, and it fits maybe somewhere in the kind of day-to-day life of some people. Some people tell me that, they listen to it when they're walking the dog or if they're going for a run, which is quite bizarre. When I'd be listening to music, they're listening to my podcast when they're going for a run. I never understand that, but hey, I'm not going to welcome it. It's great. But so yeah, they can really surprise us, I think, sometimes, the audience. But I think you're right that, because of the level of commitment that they need to do to really engage with this as a channel, that they have to be loyal just by default. It's a loyal channel, which is great for producers and podcasters, because then that if you do have a following, it's a following that's with you for quite some time. They're not going to be as fickle as some of the other channels where, you might get the, so say, reach, but you don't know who's actually watching or who actually saw it. At least here we know that they're engaged, which is hugely positive, but we just don't know which bits they're engaged with. And I think there's the gap. It comes full circle again, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And then to your point earlier about the advertisers and businesses that actually want to, get whatever message they have out there, as long as they know that they're getting to a loyal following and they know exactly who those people are, if that matches up with their, with their, whatever they're trying to do, whatever their business is or company does, you become a really, really interesting and incredibly valuable asset to them from an advertising perspective. I meant to ask this early on, and maybe I just got frazzled because I was a couple minutes late. But what is the goal of your podcast? What are you hoping to really achieve?
So my goal, I guess, is, no, I don't guess. I know what my goal is. Why am I saying I guess? I do know what my goal of my podcast is. I've been in marketing now for 3.5 decades. Okay, so I'm one of the old guys. I was here before, the internet, literally that old. So I can remember, really pre-digital marketing. And what I guess I want to see with the podcast in how it evolves over time, whether it goes to the metaverse in time or whatever happens to it, I would love it to be the channel that is my legacy. I really enjoy interviewing people. I absolutely enjoy people sort of on the podcast and kind of sharing, kind of best practice and really adding value. And I would love it if this was the thing that, in time, 2 decades time or whatever it is, however long I decide to keep this thing going, that was the thing that I'm doing. So do I need to monetize it? I think monetizing would be interesting. I don't need to monetize it, but it would be handy. Yes, universe, I am saying it would be good. But it's kind of something I think that just can always be there. Whereas, clients have a natural life cycle. Certain sectors have a natural life cycle with the kind of services that somebody like me would offer. Whereas the podcast could be something that would never get dated, because there's always going to be new people to interview. There's always going to be new topics to cover. So I think, I'm certainly playing the long game here. This is a strategic thing that I could see, outlasting everything else I do professionally. So yeah, I'm really behind it. One, because I love it, but two, I just think the market just buys into this. And as you said, there is so much going on in this space. I think anybody in my position would be a bit of a fool not to, be in this for the long game. So that's kind of how I see it. So there, I've nailed my sort of colours to the mast there with that statement. So nobody else knows that. So this is secret stuff that I'm revealing here. So it's all good. It's all good.
Well, I mean, hey, in 20 years' time, we're going to have a lot of archived information that you're going to need playlists for. So.
Absolutely.
It'll be a nightmare to sift through all of that.
10,000 episodes in. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this is incredibly helpful. There's a lot of stuff here that, Mahdi said it earlier. There's a lot of stuff here that we never even considered. And I think that we're again, kind of on this journey that we're uncovering as much value and hopeful value, I guess, future value, that could be had from a lot of what, podcasters are telling us, including yourselves. I think that there is so much in this industry that does seem it's rather untapped still. It seems like it is sort of in its infancy, almost like the, kind of the .com era where it became really popular. Everything became very popular in the internet, on the internet, and then all of a sudden it crashed, and everybody's like, "Well, I'm not sure if I can trust anything anymore. Let's go back to the old world for a hot second." I think that podcasting is similar to that, in that there's so many services out there, but for the long run, I would imagine there's not going to be nearly as many that really help and really, define, every pain point and problem that you ultimately have moving forward. So I can imagine the one of understanding your audience and the reporting to better tailor the topics of interest and things of that nature, and archiving old content is not going to go away anytime soon. The goal really is you have this idea, you have this message that you want to convey, and then it's just conveying that message to the audience and making sure you have a loyal following.
And I think any kind of platform that can support all of that, ideally in one place, which makes life a lot easier, I think is going to be the winner. Really, I do. I think there's something that you guys are developing and evolving as thinking and as a concept. I think that is, as I said earlier, really, really exciting. And that's why I wanted this conversation, because I think, from my side of things, it's always useful to know kind of what's coming and what's being thought of and what's being developed. And I'm really excited to see where you take this. Genuinely.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.